Illinois, Mid-19th Century Politics and the Civil War, Part 3. In 1860, Illinois had a population of 7.3 million, with almost more than a million people than it had in 1850. And actually, while I'm talking about this, let me put up the Illinois map of the counties. At its time, the African American population was about 8,000. Chicago had a population of over 100,000, and the state had several large cities such as Peoria, Galena, Alton, Quincy, Freeport, and Rock Island. Before the shooting started, Illinois had a railroad network and the beginnings of an industrial system, in addition to fertile soil for agriculture. But it only ranked fourth in agricultural output and 15th in industrial output. By the end of the war, though, Illinois was going to be an economic powerhouse. Factories in Chicago, Moline, and other cities used mass production methods to make their agricultural reapers and plows that would help to mechanize agriculture. Small shops expanded into factories with the war following the lead of Cyrus McCormick and John Deere. Those plants, McCormick in Chicago making reapers and Deere in Moline making plows. At Canton, William Parlin expanded his shop in which turned out the first steel bottom plow. William Burson invented a grain binder that featured a machine that tied the grain sheaves into knots. There was Edward Helger and Richard Matheson. They were recent immigrants from Germany. And because of the coal supplies in LaSalle County, they thought it'd be an ideal site for the nation's first zinc smelter. And the zinc ore was shipped by the Illinois Railroad, and it was a byproduct of Galena lead mines. Railroads and farm machinery required immense amounts of iron. Chicago began developing as a heavy metal center even before the war began. A man by the name of Ward developed iron works in Illinois and began to specialize in rails. In 1865, he was credited with rolling the first steel produced in the U.S. Ward's Illinois plant in 1869 made about 1/3 of the iron and steel produced in the United States. With the outbreak of the war, Illinois was having a difficult time finding good markets for its corn and wheat. But however, as the war went on, the U.S. government began to buy Illinois agricultural products in large amounts. Also during the war, Chicago solidified itself in its position as a railroad center of the interior and will wind up becoming the railroad hub of the country in the late 19th century. And I think to this very day, Illinois, with Chicago, is still a major railroad center for the nation. Women were not allowed to join the army. However, some women disguised themselves as men and did so. Excuse me. One Illinois woman was by the name of Jenny Hodges. She had joined the military and served in combat. Her gender was not detected, though, until 1919, when she was sent to a veterans hospital after a car accident. Women, though, were able to support the warfare at home. Some of their primary tasks included taking over the farm and businesses of their husbands or assisting male relatives, which is really the most important thing that women did, was help to manage farms and businesses while their husbands, male relatives, were away fighting. They volunteered just to sew uniforms, make flags and banners, prepare bandages. They held benefits for the war effort, and many joined the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which helped with medical care for Union armies and also helped with families whose husbands had died in the war. Some women traveled to the camps and battlefields as nurses and comforted the wounded in makeshift hospitals that sprang up near battle zones. One of the most famous of these women was Mary Ann Beckerdike. There's a photograph of her. She was a widow from Galesburg, Illinois. She was almost as famous as Grant and Sherman during her day. She started her service in Cairo, and the newspapers often referred to her as a cyclone in Calico. Bickerdike attacked the sordid conditions she found in the hospitals along with a number of other women, and she helped supervise scrubbing the floors, the medical equipment, and establishing laundries. Before her efforts and those of other women, wounded soldiers would just lay in their hospital beds in their soiled uniforms and were operated on, and they were operated on with instruments that were never cleaned. The bedding was just simply burned when the soldiers either died or left the hospital. So what these women brought was a sense of sanitation. So cleaning the instruments, cleaning the blood off the floors, setting up laundries for dressing gowns and for for the sheets and all that kind of stuff with the bedding. So they really helped in many respects to save lives just by helping to reduce germs and their ability to freely make their way around the hospitals, these field hospitals in particular. Not everyone back home supported the war effort, and with the abolition of slavery as part of the wartime goals, that created a great deal of dissent. During the winter of 1862 and 63, discontent and discouragement permeated throughout the state of Illinois, and that had a lot to do with the fact that the war was moving on into its third year, and there didn't seem to be any end in sight, and it was also because of the Emancipation Proclamation. The chief opponents of the war at the home front were Copperheads. And so Copperheads were Confederate sympathizers, and many of them lived in the southern part of Illinois. But much of that sentiment you could find in Springfield, you could find in Chicago, you could basically find it anywhere in the state, but it was more concentrated in the southern part of the state. McDonough County, where Macomb is and Western University resides, had sizable Copperhead activity. But it really depended on where you were in the county. So, for example, in the eastern part of this county, in a little town called Tennessee that was settled by Southerners, there was really strong sympathy for the Confederacy. However, in the northern part of the county, which was settled by New Englanders, there was strong support for the Union and for the war. After every Union defeat, Copperheads would write articles and give speeches encouraging an end to the war, somewhat as far as advocating soldiers to desert. In Fulton County, which is just to the east of McDonough County, the Canton Weekly Register was Republican and pro-war, while the Fulton Democrat was openly Copperhead. And then here in Macomb, you have the Macomb Eagle, which was Democratic and a Democratic newspaper and Copperhead, and the Macomb Journal was Republican and pro-war. And so a number of these towns would have these newspapers that were just more political partisan newspapers than the kind of objective journalism that we start to see happening in the 20th century. Copperheads in the newspapers criticized emancipation, the war, the draft, increasing casualties. They would also dismiss the resolutions that regiments would pass. Word would be sent back home that there was an overwhelming support for emancipation and other pro-union resolutions passed by popular vote by the regiments. In order to create support for a variety of union policies, commanders would draft resolutions and allow soldiers to vote on them. Now, there was peer pressure, which helped to ensure that soldiers would vote as a bloc. So vote totals were then sent back home, usually slanted in favor of union policies. So Copperhead editors would attack such votes as fraudulent and argue that they did not depict the true sentiment of the soldiers at the front. Now, it is true that these votes there could be pressure to vote a certain way, and they were far from unanimous. But the historical record makes it clear that the majority of Union soldiers, particularly as the war wore on, supported emancipation. Copperheads would also publish letters from soldiers sent home from the front criticizing the war and criticizing Union policies. Some Copperheads organized themselves into quasi-military units and harassed Union supporters, would attack them at times, wrecking their property, and spread a lot of fear and insecurity. In some cases, federal troops had to be called to deal with violence. The worst clash occurred at the Courthouse Square in Charleston, in the eastern part of the state. This was also a very strong center of Copperhead activity. There was a riot between Union soldiers who were on furlough and armed Copperheads that resulted in several deaths. An unfortunate effect of Copperhead activity was that it encouraged gangs of outlaws from Missouri and elsewhere to slip into the state and create further havoc. For example, the Clingman gang committed a variety of violent acts until they were pushed out by Southern Illinois vigilantes. One of the main problems in Illinois was that it lacked strong Democratic leadership in support of the war effort. Douglas was dead. Congressional representatives such as John Logan and John McLaren, they resigned their seats and became generals in the army. In fact, a lot of Democratic politicians in the state were loyal and they were considered pro-war Democrats, and some of them eventually became Republicans. But they were serving in the military and weren't based in Illinois as Democratic politicians. The Democrats were able to win the 62 elections and therefore controlled the legislature in 63, making life very difficult for Governor Yates. The Democrats criticized Lincoln for the Emancipation Proclamation. They passed resolutions condemning military arrests of civilians. They advocated the South should be allowed to join the Union, return to the Union with slave state status, and they blamed the New Englanders for a partisan war. At Springfield, the House of Representatives proposed that appointed officers and all war spending in Illinois need to be turned over to a three-man commission. It adopted resolutions listing grievances against Lincoln and the governor and advocated for an armistice with the South. At this point, Republicans basically had enough of these attacks from quote unquote peace Democrats and really thought of them as traitors to the Union. 2 weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg, Democrats held a demonstration at Camp Yates near the Capitol, and 40,000 Illinoisans turned out to condemn the war. So that's really important to keep in mind. 40,000 Illinoisans turned out to condemn the war. They're not all Copperheads, but many people were becoming fatigued by the war and the death total that as it increased through time. Sympathizers with the Confederacy created the Knights of the Golden Circle. This was a secret society imported from the South. It spread into Copperhead regions and in 1863 reorganized under the name of the Order of the American Knights. S. Kerning Judd was a Democratic operative from Lewistown. He became the commander of the society, and in 1864, it changed its name to the Sons of Liberty. Now, this wasn't the only state, Illinois, that had Copperheads active. They were active in all of the northern states, but especially Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, but even New York and New York City had plenty of Copperhead activity and sentiment. The Sons of Liberty plotted with the Confederate agents in 1864 to start an armed insurrection in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri. This was known as the Northwest Conspiracy. Although they claimed they had over 100,000 supporters in the Northwest and they were preparing for a rebellion, no rebellion ever took place. Just a few brawls, basically. The rural Copperheads were never strong enough or bold enough to attack a Union garrison, and that's tended to be where the stronghold of the Copperhead sentiment was in rural areas, not so much in urban areas. Illinois voters approved the calling of another constitutional convention, which got underway in 1862. The Peace Democrats dominated the convention and tried to use it to promote their anti-war stand. They made much of the fact that Governor Yates had authorized agents to pay more for military supplies than the federal government had authorized. But in attacking his policies, they made a tactical error. Governor Yates had worked very hard to see to it that Illinois soldiers were well cared for and their families appreciated his efforts. He had visited the battlefields after some of the bloodiest confrontations and took personal interest in providing medical care and evacuation for the wounded. After responding to a number of requests for more information about his activities, Governor Yates basically lost his patience and told the delegates that they were in no position to interfere with his duties as governor. The delegates eventually sensed the mood of the public and voted to provide the money to Governor Yates. They eventually got down to writing the new Constitution. However, the public was basically disgusted with what they were up to, and the voters rejected the document. By the time 1864 presidential campaign got underway, Union armies were locked in some of the fiercest and costliest campaigns of the war. Grant went from being a hero to being called a butcher. Democrats ran General George McClellan as their candidate, and they wanted peace at any price. At this low point in Lincoln's political affairs, General Logan returned to Illinois to campaign for Lincoln. Logan's aid proved invaluable and made it possible for Lincoln to carry his home state. Unfortunately, there was also some new victories on the battlefield in Georgia, which brought an upsurge of support for the president. Lincoln won with a large majority of Union soldiers supporting him, and he won his home state. Republicans also won big in Illinois. Major General Richard Oglesby became governor of the state, and Yates won a seat in the U.S. Senate, and Republicans took back control of the state legislature. Of course, Lincoln was shot and killed in April of 65. Officials in Washington wanted Lincoln to be buried there, but a delegation from Illinois persuaded Mrs. Lincoln to have his body returned to Springfield. A train draped in black slowly transported Lincoln's body back to Illinois, and he was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery on May 4th in Springfield. Now, like a lot of states in the post-Civil War period, they went through a number of changes. Illinois was similar to other states in that regard, and I just wanted to focus here for a few moments on the Constitution of 1870. So in the post-war period, Illinois had become a solidly Republican state. It backed Grant for president in 1868, and Republicans with control of legislature was able to repeal the black laws. At the urging of Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull, Illinois passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The problems of the Illinois Constitution persisted in the post-war period, and Republicans were determined to make a number of changes and basically create a new constitution. And the old constitution had some strange provisions. For example, Illinoisans could bring such issues as changing their names, adopting children, or starting small businesses before the General Assembly for approval. During some legislative sessions, more time was spent on these what were called private bills than on public matters. This happened at the 1867 legislative session when laws passed for the public good only filled about a 200-page booklet, while those for private bills filled 2,500 pages in a number of very thick volumes. The Constitution of 1870 basically brought this practice to an end. In the new Constitution, the word white was deleted from the voting article. Elijah Haynes, a member of the Voting Rights Committee, asked the word male also be struck so that women could also vote. His suggestion was not followed, but the delegates did consider giving voters a chance to vote on women's suffrage as a separate issue when they cast their ballots for the new Constitution. That vote never came up. Delegates said that they were offended by the demands that some suffragettes made in terms of pursuing that issue for the Constitution. In 1869, 1870, delegates met in Springfield and completed a new constitution in May, and voters approved it in July, and it went into effect in August. This was the third state constitution, and it would last for 100 years. The delegates also broke new ground when they gave the General Assembly the power to pass laws regulating railroads. Oh, sorry, I forgot to put up the voting thing here. So regulate railroads. So shortly after the new constitution was ratified, the General Assembly passed a law regulating the railroads and setting up a board of railroad and warehouse commissioners. The commissioners forbade railroads the right to charge different rates to different customers. This regulatory board was the first of its kind in the nation. And as you're reading your textbook, as we get into the post-Civil War period, this is also when we start to see challenges to big corporations, which corporations were really taking off during the Civil War and the post-Civil War period. And farmers in particular were upset with the way that railroads would charge them different rates for their produce, getting their produce to market. And in some respects, railroads basically had a stranglehold on transportation, and many farmers just felt that they were being extorted. And so they took their complaints to the legislature, state legislatures, and Illinois was one of the first state legislatures that tried to create laws that would benefit farmers, and Illinois was a major farming state. The law, though, was a challenge in the Illinois Supreme Court and found to be unconstitutional, though the law was rewritten to allow railroads to charge a different rate on some lines if they could prove that the line was costing them in profits. And this was eventually upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court.